By the end of World War II, over 23,000 German bridges lay in ruins across the Eastern Front. What the Wehrmacht never expected was that many of these critical lifelines would be destroyed by women they had openly mocked as girls playing war. This is the story of history's most underestimated air force and how their enemies' laughter turned to terror in the frozen skies above. Russia. June 22, 1941. The High German Army Group South thunders across the Soviet border as Operation Barbarossa unleashes 3 million Wehrmacht soldiers into Stalin's territory. In the command bunkers, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, German officers intercept Soviet radio transmissions boasting of their heroic female aviators. The response is universal. Laughter. Women pilots. Major Klaus Brenner of the 6th Army would later write to his wife, "The Bolsheviks must be more desperate than we thought. What's next? Schoolgirls with rifles?" His fellow officers shared cigarettes and jokes about Russian propaganda, growing so absurd that Stalin was apparently recruiting housewives to fly planes. To these battle-hardened veterans, who had conquered Poland and France, the very notion seemed like a comedy act. But as the Wehrmacht's armored spearheads punched deeper into Soviet territory, something strange began happening in the darkness. Soldiers manning checkpoints along crucial river crossings reported odd sounds in the night. Not the roar of engines they expected from Soviet aircraft, but an eerie whistling like wind through fabric. Then came the explosions. Bridge after bridge spanning the Dnieper, the Don, and countless smaller waterways began collapsing without warning. German engineers, confident in their concrete and steel construction, found their masterworks reduced to twisted wreckage by morning light. The attacks came so silently that sentries often didn't realize they were under assault until the bombs were already falling. In the pre-dawn hours of July 15, 1941, Wehrmacht troops securing a vital crossing near Kremenchug watched in bewilderment as shadows flitted overhead, not the expected metal bombers, but what appeared to be ancient biplanes, barely visible against the star-scattered sky. "It looked like something from the last war," Corporal Heinrich Müller would later recall. "We thought it was some kind of training exercise gone wrong." The laughter was about to die in their throats. While German soldiers dismissed these nighttime phantoms as desperate Soviet theatrics, deep within the corridors of the Kremlin, a woman was about to change the course of aerial warfare forever. Marina Raskova stood before Stalin himself in October 1941, her hands steady despite the weight of what she was proposing. Already a national hero for her record-breaking flights across the Soviet Union, Raskova possessed something rare in Stalin's brutal regime: his genuine respect. As German forces pressed toward Moscow and the Red Army hemorrhaged men and machines, she presented an audacious plan, entire air regiments staffed exclusively by women. "Comrade Stalin," she said, her voice cutting through the tobacco smoke that perpetually clouded the dictator's office. "Our young women are volunteering faster than we can process them. They're begging to fight. Why not let them prove themselves in the air?" Stalin's response would echo through history. "If our women are determined to fight the fascists, then let them have their chance to burn the sky." Within weeks, recruitment offices across the Soviet Union were flooded with female volunteers. They came from every corner of society: university students abandoning their studies, teachers leaving their classrooms, farm girls trading plows for aircraft controls. 18-year-old Nadezhda Popova left her engineering courses at Moscow University, telling her horrified parents, "The Nazis are at our gates. Books can wait." 20-year-old Yekaterina Budanova, a factory worker from Smolensk, hitchhiked 300 miles to reach the nearest recruitment center. The women who gathered at Engels Flying School in early 1942 faced conditions that would have broken seasoned soldiers. Soviet resources were stretched to breaking point, and the female regiments received equipment that regular male units had rejected as obsolete or dangerous. Their assigned aircraft, the Polikarpov PO-2 biplane, was a relic from the 1920s, constructed of wood, canvas, and wire. Aviation experts privately called them flying coffins, but Marina Raskova saw potential where others saw problems. The Po-2's ancient design meant it flew too slowly for German radar to track effectively. Its lightweight construction allowed it to operate from rough fields that would destroy heavier aircraft. Most importantly, its maximum speed was actually slower than the stall speed of German fighters, meaning Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs literally could not slow down enough to engage them in combat. Under Raskova's relentless training regimen, these young women transformed from civilians into warriors. They learned to navigate by stars when compasses failed, to land on frozen fields in complete darkness, and to keep flying when fear threatened to paralyze them. The physical demands were crushing. Many lost 30 pounds during training as they struggled to handle aircraft that required pure muscle strength to control. As winter deepened and the Battle of Stalingrad raged, the newly formed 588th Night Bomber Regiment prepared for their first combat missions. None of them knew they were about to become legends. The transformation from students and farm girls to combat pilots would be written in fire across the night skies of the Eastern Front. March 1942. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment receives their first operational assignment: destroy German supply lines feeding the advance toward the Caucasus oil fields. As their Po-2 biplanes taxi across the frozen airfield at Morozovskaya, the irony is inescapable. These obsolete aircraft are about to revolutionize nighttime warfare. Navigator Katya Ryabova climbs into the rear cockpit of her Po-2, her breath forming clouds in the -30 air. At 19, she's already mastered a technique that would terrify German soldiers for the next 3 years. "We learned to become ghosts," she would later write in her memoir. "Our engines were so quiet that sleeping guards never heard us coming." The Night Witches, as German soldiers would christen them, developed tactics born from necessity and perfected through repeated brushes with death. Flying at altitudes barely above treetop level, they would approach their targets with engines throttled back to minimum power. Then, at the last possible moment, they would cut their engines entirely and glide silently toward their objectives. The psychological effect was devastating. German sentries, accustomed to the roar of conventional bombers, found themselves under attack by aircraft that seemed to materialize from thin air. The only warning was a soft whistling sound, wind rushing over fabric wings, followed immediately by explosions. Many Wehrmacht soldiers reported that the attacks felt supernatural, as if the very darkness had turned against them. But the women paid a terrible price for their stealth advantage. Flying without radios meant they couldn't coordinate with friendly forces or call for help when shot down. They carried no parachutes, partly due to equipment shortages, but mainly because the Po-2 flew too low for parachutes to deploy effectively. If their aircraft was hit, their only option was to attempt a crash landing and hope for survival. The lack of radios forced the crews to develop an intricate system of visual signals and timing. Nadia Popova, who would become one of the regiment's most decorated pilots, remembered the terrifying precision required. "We had to trust each other completely. In the darkness, separated by miles, we still had to arrive over the target within seconds of each other. One mistake meant death, ours or our friends. Their weapons were as primitive as their aircraft. Each Po-2 could carry a maximum of 220 pounds of bombs, roughly equivalent to a single modern artillery shell. But what they lacked in firepower, they made up for in accuracy and persistence. Night after night, they returned to the same targets, dropping their small bombs with surgical precision until even the strongest German fortifications crumbled. The West Regiment's first major success came during the Battle of the North Caucasus in summer 1942. German forces, confident in their superior equipment and training, had constructed a series of bridges across the Kuban River to support their advance toward the Baku oil fields. These bridges represented months of engineering work and were considered virtually indestructible. The Night Witches proved otherwise. Flying up to 8 missions per night, an exhausting pace that left pilots barely able to climb from their cockpits, they systematically targeted the bridge supports with their small bombs. Each attack was pinpoint accurate, placed where German engineers had least expected to need reinforcement. By dawn on August 15, 1942, 3 major bridges lay twisted in the Kuban River. German advance units, suddenly cut off from their supply lines, found themselves surrounded by Soviet forces that had seemed on the verge of collapse just days earlier. As news of these impossible victories spread through Wehrmacht command, the laughter that had once greeted mentions of Soviet female pilots transformed into something far more sinister. Respect mixed with fear. The autumn of 1942 marked the beginning of Germany's long nightmare. With the Night Witches, what had started as isolated bridge attacks evolved into a comprehensive campaign of psychological warfare that left entire divisions jumping at shadows. Oberst Friedrich Krebs, commanding officer of the 389th Infantry Division, sent increasingly frantic reports to Army Group South headquarters. These attacks are unlike anything we've encountered. The aircraft appear without warning, strike with impossible accuracy, then vanish before our searchlights can find them. My men are reporting ghost sightings. Morale is collapsing. The German military, renowned for its tactical adaptation, found itself helpless against an enemy that violated every principle of conventional warfare. Luftwaffe fighter pilots, accustomed to high-speed aerial duels, discovered their Messerschmitt Bf-109s were useless against targets that flew barely faster than a bicycle. Anti-aircraft guns, calibrated for fast-moving bombers at high altitude, couldn't depress low enough to target the tree-skimming Po-2s. Most infuriating of all, German radar stations, the technological pride of the Wehrmacht, simply couldn't detect aircraft made of wood and fabric. The Night Witches existed in a technological blind spot that rendered Germany's most advanced defensive systems completely useless. The psychological impact spread far beyond the immediate battle zones. Wehrmacht soldiers began reporting witch sightings across the entire Eastern Front. Men who had conquered half of Europe found themselves sleeping in shifts, scanning empty skies for enemies that might or might not be there. The mere possibility of a night witch attack was enough to keep entire regiments awake, exhausted and on edge. German propaganda, always quick to adapt enemy successes into proof of Soviet desperation, struggled to explain how untrained peasant women were systematically destroying Wehrmacht infrastructure. Joseph Goebbels himself was forced to address the phenomenon in a November 1942 radio broadcast. The Bolsheviks have stooped to sending their women to die in obsolete aircraft. This proves their military situation is even more hopeless than we believed, but private German reports told a different story. Intelligence assessments captured after the war revealed grudging admiration for the Night Witches' tactical innovation. The enemy has discovered a vulnerability in our defensive doctrine, wrote Major General Walter Model. Their unconventional approach negates our technological superiority. Through methods we never anticipated, the women themselves remained largely unaware of their growing legend, flying multiple missions each night, maintaining their primitive aircraft with salvaged parts, and living on rations that barely sustained life. They focused entirely on survival and mission completion. Tamara Kazarinova, a pilot who flew over 300 combat missions, later described their mindset. "We didn't think about being heroes or making history. We just wanted to kill fascists and live until morning." Their dedication came at an enormous cost. By winter 1942, the 508th Night Bomber Regiment had already lost a third of its original personnel. Aircraft were shot down, crashed during emergency landings, or simply disappeared into the vast darkness of the Eastern Front. The survivors pushed themselves beyond human endurance, flying until they collapsed from exhaustion, then flying again. But their efforts were beginning to tip the strategic balance. German logistics networks, disrupted by months of precise nighttime attacks, struggled to maintain the supply flows necessary for major offensive operations. Bridges that took weeks to construct were destroyed in single nights. Ammunition dumps, fuel depots, and communication centers fell victim to bombs that seemed to fall from nowhere. As 1943 dawned and the tide of war began shifting, the Night Witches faced their greatest test and delivered their most devastating blow to German ambitions. The Battle of Stalingrad had ended in catastrophic defeat for the Wehrmacht, but German forces still controlled vast stretches of Soviet territory. Their strategy now focused on defensive operations, using the river barriers of the Dnieper and Don to create an impregnable line that would halt Soviet advances indefinitely. This defensive strategy depended entirely on bridges, hundreds of spans that allowed German forces to move reserves, supplies, and reinforcements between threatened sectors. German engineers, learning from earlier Night Witch attacks, had redesigned these bridges with stronger supports, better camouflage, and concentrated anti-aircraft defenses. The 588th Regiment, now expanded into the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment in recognition of their combat record, received orders that would define the remainder of the war. Destroy the bridges, all of them. Squadron Commander Yevdokia Bershanskaya gathered her pilots on a frozen airfield near Kursk in February 1943. The women who assembled around her bore little resemblance to the students and farm girls who had volunteered 2 years earlier. They moved with the efficient precision of combat veterans, their faces marked by frostbite scars and eyes that had seen too much death. Comrades, Bershanskaya announced, the fascists believe their bridges will protect them. Tonight we proved them wrong. The campaign that followed would be remembered as one of the most successful strategic bombing operations of World War II, achieved with aircraft that most military experts considered worthless. Flying in conditions that grounded conventional bombers, the Night Witches systematically dismantled German defensive infrastructure across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Their tactics had evolved far beyond simple bridge attacks. Working in coordinated groups, they would strike multiple targets simultaneously, overwhelming German defenses through sheer volume of attacks. Decoy flights drew searchlights and anti-aircraft fire away from the primary strike forces. Diversionary raids convinced German commanders that attacks were coming from entirely different directions. The bridge over the Dnieper at Zaporozhye became a symbol of this new phase of warfare. German engineers had spent 6 months constructing what they considered an indestructible span, protected by concentrated flak batteries and fighter patrols. The bridge was considered so vital that Hitler personally ordered its defense, declaring it essential to the survival of Army Group South. On the night of March 15, 1943, 18 Po-2 biplanes approached Zaporozhye from multiple directions. Flying at altitudes so low their wheels nearly touched the water, they executed a complex attack pattern that had been rehearsed dozens of times. The first wave destroyed the searchlights and anti-aircraft positions. The second wave targeted the bridge approaches, trapping defenders on the span itself. The final wave, led by Nadia Popova, delivered precision strikes against the bridge's main supports. By dawn, the indestructible bridge lay in pieces at the bottom of the Dnieper River. German forces on the eastern bank, suddenly cut off from retreat routes, were surrounded and captured within hours. The strategic implications rippled across the entire front as German commanders realized that no position, no matter how well defended, was safe from the Night Witches. Wehrmacht morale, already shaken by the disaster at Stalingrad, plummeted further as reports of bridge collapses spread through the ranks. Soldiers who had once mocked Soviet female pilots now spoke of them in whispers, attributing almost supernatural powers to women who could strike anywhere, anytime without warning. The German military hierarchy, finally acknowledging the threat, placed bounties on Night Witch pilots that exceeded those offered for tank aces or fighter pilots. Luftwaffe squadrons were reassigned from other fronts, specifically to hunt the Po-2 biplanes. Special anti-aircraft units were created with weapons designed for low-altitude targets. None of it worked. The Night Witches continued their relentless campaign, adapting to each new German countermeasure with innovations that kept them one step ahead of their enemies. They had transformed from laughingstock to nightmare, proving that in warfare, the most dangerous enemy is often the one you underestimate. By 1944, the once mighty Wehrmacht found itself trapped in a nightmare of their own, making it haunted by shadows they couldn't catch and bridges they couldn't protect. The systematic destruction of German river crossings had reached a crescendo that defied military logic. Over 17,000 tons of German supplies were lost when Night Witch attacks severed supply lines at critical moments. Entire divisions found themselves stranded without ammunition, fuel, or medical supplies as bridge after bridge collapsed into the rivers of Eastern Europe. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored warfare, wrote in his private journal, "We are fighting ghosts who appear from nowhere and vanish before we can respond. Our most advanced fighters cannot catch biplanes from the previous war. Our radar sees nothing. Our flak guns fire at empty sky. This is not warfare, it is witchcraft. The psychological impact had spread far beyond the immediate combat zones. Wehrmacht soldiers across the Eastern Front reported sleepless nights, constantly scanning the horizon for the dreaded silhouettes of approaching BOUNTIES. Medical reports documented increasing cases of Nachthexen, syndrome a form of combat stress specifically, triggered by the fear of night witch attacks. German propaganda, which had initially dismissed the female pilots as evidence of Soviet desperation, now struggled to explain their continued effectiveness. Radio broadcasts warned German civilians that the enemy was using unnatural methods and supernatural assistance. The very women who had once been objects of mockery were now portrayed as supernatural threats, requiring divine intervention to defeat. But perhaps the most telling evidence of the Night Witch's impact came from captured German documents, tactical assessments written by professional soldiers who had abandoned all pretense of dismissing their enemy. Colonel Hans von Luck, a veteran of campaigns across Europe and Africa, wrote in his final intelligence report, "These women have achieved something our finest pilots could not. They have made the darkness itself our enemy." The 46th Guards Regiment, now expanded to over 200 aircraft and 400 crew members, had evolved into a precision instrument of strategic warfare. Their missions extended far beyond simple bridge destruction to encompass a comprehensive campaign against German logistics networks. Railway junctions, fuel depots, communication centers, and ammunition storage facilities all fell victim to bombs that seemed to fall from the very stars themselves. Nina Raspopova, by now a hero of the Soviet Union with over 800 combat missions, described the surreal experience of watching German defensive measures evolve in response to their attacks. They tried everything: more searchlights, different guns, faster fighters, better camouflage. Nothing worked. We were fighting with methods they couldn't understand, using aircraft they couldn't catch. The final phase of the Night Witches' War began with Operation Bagration in June 1944, the massive Soviet offensive that shattered German Army Group Center. As Red Army forces surged westward, the female pilots flew ahead of the advance, systematically destroying every bridge, tunnel, and river crossing that might allow German forces to establish new defensive lines. The Vistula River campaign epitomized their tactical evolution. German engineers, learning from 3 years of bitter experience, had constructed bridges designed specifically to resist night witch attacks. Lower profiles, stronger supports, concentrated defenses, and redundant crossing points. They believed they had finally solved the puzzle of the fabric-winged phantoms. They were wrong. On the night of July 23, 1944, the largest night witch operation of the war targeted 17 bridges along a 100-mile stretch of the Vistula. Over 60 PO-2 biplanes, operating in coordinated waves, executed a series of attacks so precise and devastating that German defensive doctrine was completely rewritten. The bridges didn't just collapse, they were obliterated. German engineers who had spent months perfecting their defensive designs watched helplessly as structures they considered impregnable were reduced to twisted wreckage in a single night. The psychological effect on defending troops was so severe that entire regiments abandoned their positions without orders, fleeing westward in panic. By dawn, the Vistula River, Germany's last major defensive barrier before the homeland itself, had become an impassable obstacle for German forces rather than Soviet ones. Wehrmacht units trapped on the eastern bank surrendered in unprecedented numbers, often specifically requesting to surrender to anyone except the Night Witches. As Soviet forces crossed the Vistula on hastily constructed pontoon bridges, they found German positions abandoned so completely that equipment, weapons, and personal belongings remained scattered where their owners had dropped them in their haste to escape the approaching darkness. As the Third Reich crumbled and victory became inevitable, even Germany's most fanatical defenders began acknowledging what they had refused to admit. For 3 years, they had been defeated by women they once considered a joke. The final German assessment of the Night Witches, found in Wehrmacht archives after Berlin's fall, represented a complete reversal of military opinion that had taken 4 years and hundreds of destroyed bridges to achieve. Written by Colonel General Georg Hans Reinhardt, commander of Army Group Center, the report abandoned all pretense of propaganda or face-saving. The 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment represents the most effective tactical innovation developed by Soviet forces during this conflict. Their unconventional methods negated our technological advantages and exploited vulnerabilities in our defensive doctrine that we never recognized. These women achieved strategic objectives using obsolete equipment through superior tactics, unmatched dedication, and a level of courage that commands respect even from their enemies. Soviet archives reveal that by war's end, the Night Witches had flown over 23,000 combat missions, dropped more than 20,000 tons of bombs, and destroyed or damaged hundreds of bridges, rail junctions, and supply depots. But statistics cannot capture the full measure of their achievement. They had revolutionized nighttime warfare while simultaneously proving that the most dangerous military assumptions are those made about enemies you choose not to take seriously. The individual stories of these women read like legends carved from the frozen darkness of the Eastern Front. Nadia Popova flew 852 combat missions, surviving 18 aircraft shot down beneath her. Yekaterina Budanova became the first female fighter ace in history before being killed in aerial combat over Kursk. Marina Raskova, the visionary who convinced Stalin to trust women with weapons, died in an aircraft crash while leading reinforcements to the front. By war's end, 23 Night Witches had earned the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military decoration in the Red Army. Dozens more received the Order of Lenin, the Order of the Red Banner, and other honors that recognized their exceptional service. But perhaps the greatest tribute came from an unexpected source: captured German soldiers who spoke of their enemies with the kind of respectful fear usually reserved for natural disasters. The irony was inescapable. Wehrmacht soldiers, representing a regime that considered women inherently inferior, had been systematically outfought by pilots they initially dismissed as harmless propaganda. The same men who laughed at reports of female aviators now flinched at the sound of aircraft engines in the night, never knowing whether the approaching plane carried death or merely shadows. Today, more than 8 decades after the last Night Witch mission, the lessons of their extraordinary campaign continue to echo through military academies and strategic studies courses around the world. Their story stands as a permanent reminder that in warfare, as in life, the most dangerous mistake is underestimating those who others consider weak. The bridges of Eastern Europe, rebuilt long ago, carry traffic that flows freely between nations, once locked in mortal combat. But in the collective memory of military history, those structures remain forever linked to the women who proved that strength comes in many forms, and that the most devastating weapons are often wielded by those whom others refuse to take seriously. Comment below and tell us which state you're from, and whether you'd ever heard of the Night Witches before today. These women changed the course of history while flying aircraft that their enemies considered jokes. Their legacy reminds us that victory doesn't always belong to those with the best equipment, but to those with the courage to use whatever they have with maximum effectiveness. The Wehrmacht learned too late that the most dangerous enemy is not the one you fear, but the one you mock. In the frozen skies above Russia, laughter died in the darkness, replaced by the whisper of fabric wings carrying death to those who thought themselves safe. The Night Witches proved that heroes come in all forms, and that sometimes the course of history turns on the courage of those who refuse to accept that they're not supposed to win.